My name is Dennis Nixon. I'm the Associate Dean for Research Administration at the Graduate School of Oceanography. I'm also a Professor of Marine Affairs. I'll be the moderator tonight for this presentation, a special presentation, Perspectives on the Gulf Oil Spill. With me tonight are a distinguished group of URI faculty and graduates. Beginning to my right, Professor Malcolm Spaulding from the Department of Ocean Engineering. Next, although you can't see her, there she is, Admiral Mary Landry, who's appearing on the screen, a graduate of the Marine Affairs program in 1995, I think it was, is joining us from New Orleans, where she still is at the command center. Mary was the admiral in charge of the Coast Guard district when the spill occurred. Next is Peter Cornillan, professor of oceanography, who was involved in the early estimation of the size of the spill. Chris Reddy, one of our distinguished alums from URI in our PhD program, is now at that smaller school a little bit east of here called Woods Hole Oceanographic, and led the effort on board, we're proud to say, our own vessel, the RV Endeavor, which managed to put together a cruise in very short order, thanks to the good efforts of Admiral Sam DeBow, who's over here, who put together that great slideshow that you saw as you were coming in. David Smith, the other associate dean here in the School of Oceanography, is an expert on the bacteria that were, in theory, munching at this oil, and has testified at the Senate Environment Committee on the use of Corexit as one of the choices that was made by government scientists. And finally, at the end, is Kate Moran, who is the real Associate Dean for Research and Administration. I'm the interim Associate Dean. I'm sitting in Kate's chair for 2 years while she is at the Whitehouse Office of Science and Technology. And when this happened, this spill did occupy the President's attention directly. And Kate was detailed to work on the aftermath and was involved in the decision-making process throughout. And I'll let her comment directly on what she is allowed to say about what she did and what she will be doing. There are a lot of rules, apparently, if you work in the White House as to what you're allowed to say when you come out in public. But before we begin our formal presentations, an old friend asked to address the group here tonight, someone who I worked with in the prosecution of the World Prodigy oil spill in 1989 and the prosecution of the North Cape oil spill in 1996. And that's the junior senator from Rhode Island, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. If we could have Senator Whitehouse's presentation, Bob.
Good evening. I am delighted that the University of Rhode Island is hosting this event to showcase this great institution's and our great state's preeminence in ocean and marine science and policy. From the founding of the URI Narragansett Marine Laboratory in 1936, the Graduate School of Oceanography has grown to become a world-renowned institution with the academic prowess to meet the evolving challenges to our oceans and coasts. And I'm not just saying this because Sandra, my wife, is a graduate of GSO. The Gulf oil spill was a disaster that will continue to affect the Gulf of Mexico ecosystem for years to come. And yet, if anything positive can be gleaned from that tragedy, for me it is this. Although the spill occurred hundreds of miles from our Rhode Island coastline, URI was on the front lines, studying the spill's effects, suggesting new areas of oil spill and dispersant research, and raising key legal issues regarding liability and assessment of economic and ecological damages wrought by the spill. Just a few weeks after the explosion of the Deepwater Horizon, I traveled to the Gulf with Interior Secretary Ken Salazar, Department of Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano, and EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson. I knew the extent of the spill from press reports, but it is another thing to go and see in person the damage the oil spill was wreaking on the Gulf Coast. In our flyover, I saw a massive oil slick on the surface of the Gulf, and plumes of smoke billowing off of the waters from the controlled burns. Large quantities of oil slowly began washing up on the shore, blanketing coastal beaches and wetlands vital to the economies of the Gulf states. But by the time I visited, our research ship, the Endeavor, was already in the Gulf, and the scientists aboard her had already begun their critical work mapping the underwater movement of the oil. Their work made a lasting contribution to understanding the behavior of oil at depth, in cold temperature environments, and in the presence of chemical dispersants. Chris Reddy, a native of Rhode Island and a URI graduate, from his experience investigating effects of Rhode Island's North Cape Scandia oil spill, provided testimony to Congress and spoke to the press about the Gulf oil spill and how the responders could work with nature to facilitate the evaporation and degradation of the oil. Rear Admiral Mary Landry, armed with her master's in marine affairs from URI, performed admirably as the federal on-scene coordinator of the oil spill response. Meanwhile, as the Whitehouse coordinated with federal responders to contain the spill, I was glad to know that Kate Moran, a URI oceanographer, was working with John Holdren in the Office of Science and Technology at the White House to provide critical information to the responders. As scientists struggle to determine the role of the use of chemical dispersants in the oil's behavior, as well as the potential effects of the dispersants on deep-sea microorganisms that we hoped would digest the oil, I convened a hearing to discuss these issues. David Smith of URI testified in that hearing before the full Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, lending his expertise on microorganisms to our policy discussion. As I worked with other members of the Senate, particularly on the Senate Judiciary Committee, to tackle issues of oil spill liability, I also consulted with my friend, Associate Dean Dennis Nixon. Having his expertise in admiralty law and oil spill liability, regrettably developed in oil spills on our own shores, was incredibly helpful to me, and I appreciated his input. You have such an esteemed panel tonight, and I'm sorry I'm unable to attend, but I applaud your achievements and enjoy this opportunity to recognize URI's profile in the marine science and policy fields. Your hard work has not gone unnoticed.
Well, great thanks to Senator Whitehouse, not for those kind remarks, but for the work he's been doing in the Congress on our behalf. Please come in, folks, plenty of seats. There was a flurry of interest by the Congress, just as there was after the Exxon Valdez, trying to do something that was appropriate. The Congress has not yet passed a bill, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Bob, if I could have my presentation up at this point. The format tonight is that each of us, there are 7 of us, will have about 12 minutes apiece. So we'll have myself, Malcolm, Mary, and Peter in the first hour. We will then take a break. We've got refreshments out in the lobby. And then we'll come back for our final speakers, Chris, David, and Kate. We will then have a few minutes when we get to ask each other questions, and then we will stay as long as we need to discuss with you any questions that have come up over the course of our time this evening. So the way we've timed it, we think we'll be done around 8:30, 8:45. If we go longer than 9, will somebody turn off the lights and we'll go home. So we each have played different roles in this, very complementary talents, and it does show the breadth, I think, of the kinds of interests we have at URI. I was immediately struck in terms of the shock that occurred on April 20th, 2010. When this explosion occurred, 11 people were killed almost instantly. And a spill began that ended up as the largest accidental oil spill in history, even eclipsing the famous Ixtoc oil spill. How big it was, I'm going to leave to the other experts on the panel. But we know it was very big. We know it wasn't as big as what Saddam Hussein did at the start of the Gulf War, the largest oil spill we know of in history. But it was a really big oil spill. There was shock because everyone was very surprised that an oil rig could do this. There was a tremendous sense of complacency. we have been fighting a different battle in the world of oil pollution. We've been fighting the battle of tankers running aground like the Exxon Valdez. As you know, we're always used to fighting the last war. And the last war was the war of tankers that were carrying more and more oil around the world. Until World War II, we made enough oil here in the United States. We didn't need tankers. But since then, of course, we import most of our oil from far away. And the growth of tankers has made this a very important but dangerous business. But one thing we had not expected was what happened on that day on April the 20th. An explosion, a fire, the loss of that rig, the loss of life, and the beginning of an oil spill that initially displayed our, frankly, complete lack of preparation and ignorance on how to fight a spill like this. Why were we so complacent? I'm going to try to answer that question tonight. I'm going to try and answer the question of how much do I think this will cost? And finally, how will the law change in my 12 minutes? If I could have the first slide, please. The reason we're complacent is you can see that as we look at extraction, the business of bringing oil out of the ground from the Outer Continental Shelf, looking at the estimates, the five different scholarly assessments of the amount of oil going into the oceans from the National Academy review in 2003, the business of bringing oil out of the continental shelf was only 2 or 3%. We see much more of the total oil going into the oceans from natural seeps. If you haven't paid attention to this issue in the past, there is a significant amount of oil that normally goes into the ocean in the Gulf of Mexico, off the coast of California, and off the coast of Alaska. This is because the oil is very close to the surface. In the case of California, seismic activity actually breaks the surface of the seafloor and oil bubbles to the surface. But in the Gulf of Mexico, the seeps are well known and well documented. One of the challenges I think that was in the analysis of where the spill oil was going was that there was plenty of oil in the Gulf already from natural seeps. And I'm sure Chris will address that in his remarks. The point I want to illustrate for you in terms of the change after 1990, if you look at the transportation column, look how high it is in 1985. This was the bad old days of single-hulled vessels that were running into each other a lot. After the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, which dramatically increased the penalties for spilling oil and dramatically increased the safeguards involved in the operation of oil tankers, we see the total amount of oil as a percentage plummet on the transportation side. The consumption line, you might wonder what is consumption. That's the non-point source runoff. That's the, if you look at the sources of oil in Narragansett Bay, you need look no further than I-95 and the storm drains that lead off Route 95 that go directly into the bay and its tributaries. Also, two-cycle outboard motor engines. Are one of those legal ways we all continue to pollute Narragansett Bay if you're operating a two-cycle outboard motor engine. Next slide, please. This is another reason why we're complacent. Take a look at the bottom line, the total amount of oil in thousands of tons going into the oceans. Look how good we were doing until this spill. A steady reduction, and a fairly dramatic one, from 1985 to 2003. That's why that percentage of oil coming from seeps went up so high. It's because we did such a good job of lowering the amount of oil going in from tankers and other uses. So it's not that the oil began seeping more, it's just that we reduced the other inputs, so the percentage of oil coming from seeps dramatically increased. Next. This is just an illustration of the same, that big orange, that 39% was one that was really getting worse all the time until not just the United States, but after the United States led the world with the Oil Pollution Act in 1990, other nations around the world adopted legislation very similar to ours, so that today port state control, rigorous controls are, I see the Coast Guard here in force tonight representing the law enforcement community, that the Coast Guard here and throughout the world through the International Maritime Organization exchanging information on tankers that are known to be bad operators, banning them from U.S. ports and so on. So there's been tremendous progress made in that area. But once again, because the OCS business was only 1 or 2%, we weren't paying close attention to it. Next slide. I put this up because it just shows you how little came from oil platforms. Take a look at recreational marine vessels. Those are your outboard motors. They're producing 2.1% of the total, whereas platforms less than 1%. So once again, why were we complacent about the risks in the Gulf? Because they had a very good safety record. They were not spilling oil as much as even recreational vessels were. So that answered the question of why it was we basically let an industry regulate itself. And we're put in that embarrassing situation when something did go wrong of not having solutions, not having a game plan prepared to answer the problem. Next slide, please. So how much will this oil spill cost? This is a rough number, but I think it's a calculated guess. BP has already pledged $20 billion for the Gulf Coast Claims Facility. This is a method in which they're putting in $5 billion a year for 4 years to basically pay claims of people who can fill out a reasonably straightforward claims process. It's an effort to try and keep lawyers out of the process, if you will, because certainly the lawsuits are everywhere. At least 300 lawsuits have been filed, most of them as class action lawsuits, and it's going to go on for a while. But this is an effort to get money to the people who need it right away. The cleanup, about $10 billion. The penalties and fines, that $3.5 billion, is a kind of a soft number because it depends upon how we ultimately figured out how much oil actually was spilled. And that, as you know, was a subject of great debate, and it will be the focus of the remarks of several people here tonight, how much oil did actually spill. This is not like a tanker spill when you knew in advance how many gallons were in the tanker. This was something that happened very deep, under conditions that will not sustain life. We had to measure remotely, and it turns out that the ability to measure that is going to be a critical factor in how much these fines total. I have a question mark after punitive damages because if there is sufficient evidence that comes out in the final investigations that there was the sort of negligence that would support criminal negligence, then the court may award punitive damages against BP. BP got lucky because just last year the United States Supreme Court decided a case called Exxon v. Baker, in which the Supreme Court held that punitive damages could not exceed the amount of total compensatory damages. So if compensatory is about $10 billion, then that's the amount, that's the total, that's the highest amount of punitives that a court could award. As you know, BP has taken a very unusual attitude among corporate America, saying our checkbook is open. We're going to pay legitimate claims. I don't know how long that will continue, but it has been a different kind of behavior than we have seen in corporate America in some spills in the past. Certainly, they have been much more willing to be upfront, and even an announcement just yesterday about trying to speed up the claims process so people can get money faster. This is not very much like Exxon was after the Valdez, a little different. Next slide, please. So how will the law change? One of the first questions I got from Sheldon's staff the next day virtually was, Professor Nixon, say it isn't so. There really is a $75 million cap for offshore facilities plus the removal costs. Well, unless there was gross negligence or a violation of a federal safety regulation, and as I told them then, I think there appears to be enough evidence just coming out in the daily newspapers that we're going to be able to find federal safety regulation violations so that that cap could be pierced. But one of the things that will change, I'm quite confident, in the Oil Pollution Act is a change in the amount that you can go after in these offshore facilities. This spill was unbelievable in its financial consequences. There have been discussions about removing all limitations of liability, but then the oil companies have said if you do that, then we're afraid to go drilling. And so there has to be a balance here in terms of encouraging the continuation of drilling. If you want to be able to drive to interesting evenings like this, we need the oil, but on the other hand, we need to do it safely. BP has ignored this cap, but I asked the question, will the next polluter, not everyone is one of the very major oil companies in the world and can afford to do this. Even paying $33 billion, remember, they still won't earn a profit this year. Okay. Over 300 lawsuits have already been filed, many proposed class actions. There's a group of folks in the federal court system on multi-district proceedings who met and decided that all the cases, the pretrial proceedings, will be consolidated in New Orleans. So no matter where the lawsuit was filed, they have agreed that the pretrial agreement of the statement of facts will all happen in one court in New Orleans, judicial economy, if you will, rather than 300 different courts trying to figure out the same set of facts. The panel on multi-district litigation said, we'll decide it all in one place, and then we can evaluate the individual claims for damages based on the case the individual plaintiff makes. But the actual fact scenario will be determined by one court sometime in the future. And I think that's it. Bob, any more? Yep, yeah. The Exxon Valdez resulted in 20 years of litigation. As I said, Exxon v. Baker was just decided last year. I'm sure this one will set a new record. It's very clear regulatory complacency will end, though there's still a moratorium in effect, and I hope Kate will be able to address some of the issues involved in the future of oil drilling. That's one of the things I'm hoping she's going to talk about tonight. Offshore drilling will be more expensive, but arguably safer, just based on what the oil companies themselves have volunteered to do. And just passing around the hat, it's easy to get $1 billion among this group of people. And they're actually going to begin research on a deep oil containment system, something arguably they should have done long before April the 20th, 2010. So with that, I will sit down and turn it over to our next speaker, Professor Malcolm Spaulding of the Department of Ocean Engineering. Malcolm has been involved in plotting the trajectory of oil spills probably longer than anybody else in the country, and has quite a distinguished record working on many of them around the world. Professor Spaulding.
The two instructions that Dennis gave me was get here on time and be brief. I'm here on time, and we'll see if I live up to the second promise. Okay, Bob, next slide. So I was asked to talk a couple of items. One is the size of the spill relative to what's happened historically. The other one is where the spill, use of models to determine where the spill is going to go. And the third one was what the next steps are in terms of impact assessment. So here's the history. The largest oil spill ever was not a spill. It was an intentional release in the Persian Gulf, Arabian Gulf, as a result of an attempt to deny the Allied forces access for an amphibian invasion of the coast. So pump tanks were pumped, vessels were exploded, every ability to release oil was initiated. The second largest one was a spill called the Ishtak. It was a blowout. It occurred in June of 1979 in the Bay of Campeche, which is on the other side of the Gulf of Mexico. It's the second largest. The touchstone that everybody knows about is the Exxon Valdez. That's a tanker spill. And you can compare the numbers. This spill, which is the current now number 2, is formally estimated by the official numbers at 205 million gallons, or 4 million barrels. So second largest spill ever, and the largest spill ever from a blowout, and the largest spill in U.S. history. Next. So there are the locations of these two spills. One is in this Deepwater Horizon, which is in deep water, so it's a mile deep at the spill location. And the other one was much earlier, which is in the Bay of Campeche on the other side. The one in the Ishtak spill had about the same spill scenario. The difference was that it was shallow. And the other difference was that it lasted almost 300 days. So in comparison, this spill has been relatively short. Next. If you're a firefighter, it's got to be a really frustrating picture to look at. Anyway, that's the one on the left, of course, is the new rig. The one on the right is slightly used. They're putting the fire out. And now it's available at a bargain discount price if you want to go pick it up yourself. Next. Here's what the situation looks like when the spill first occurred. The insert on the left shows the drilling rig sitting with the drill string sitting over the well. The well was 5,000 feet down to the seabed, and then 18,000 feet down to where it pierced the formation. They were in a closing operation, which is they were cementing the very lower end of that drill over the formation. And it's that casing that failed and resulted in the spill. The result was that there was a release of oil and gas up through the drill string. The blowout preventer failed, all attempts, and it eventually ended up with gas underneath the rig. The rig caught on fire, the rig lost buoyancy control, sank, and you ended up with a riser pipe that's about a mile long, crumpled the way you see it. So that's how the beginning of the accident looked like, and the spill response was an attempt to take care of this mess on the seabed. And there's a very long and complicated process by which they did that. I won't talk about that today. Next. So I was asked to talk about what goes on with oil when we spill it in the sea. And in this particular case, this is an example of the principal transport and fate processes that govern the motion of oil. Now, the wrinkle to this picture is that this was released at the seabed, but a lot of the oil at the seabed goes to the sea surface. So the oil goes up to the sea surface. We end up with it as a slick. We end up with it evaporating or volatilizing. We end up with a slick in different levels of thickness, thick and sheen. We end up with particles of oil that are dispersed in the water due to breaking waves, and they're mixed by turbulent dispersion. Biodegradation occurs to remove those small droplets of oil. Some of those droplets of oil also adhere to sediment, and they fall to the seabed. Now, the difference in scenario here is that we have the spill rather than a tanker on the sea surface. It's released from the seabed. So the oil mixes throughout the water column as it goes up. The oil and gas mixture come out of the formation hot, and so the gas is in gaseous phase, converts to a hydrate, and then the hydrate particles and oil rise to the surface, and the hydrate then eventually converts back to gas. So it's quite a complicated chemistry problem to address. Next. So this is the conventional mechanism by which we model or try to predict where oil spills are going to go. And what I'm going to do is just tell you about sort of the three major pieces of this. The top piece is the physical fate and transport. And what we're interested in, we put information in the winds and the currents, and the geography goes in. Out comes the information on the spill scenario. We enter that information. And the prediction of that is the trajectory and concentration of oil, and actually the details of all of that, which is the particle size distribution and what the oil composition is. Okay, so that part, the upper third of that diagram, is the principal focus in the spill response phase. When we go into the damage assessment or impact assessment phase, what we're then looking at is the impact on the environment. And that's handled typically in two ways, which is an exposure and a toxicity model, and then a population model. So the exposure and toxicity model might be for fish, it might be for birds, it might be for marine mammals. And the population model is to project what would happen as a result of a loss of a portion of the next generation on subsequent generations. So if you kill off a long-lived species and kill it in its early life stage, you've lost all the progeny that was related to that. So that's a damage that occurs in the future. And the time that it lasts is over the life cycle of the longest lived species. So the primary focus to date has been in the spill response phase, which is the upper third of the diagram. Next. What's happened here is to date we essentially have seen a lot of work on the forecast in support of the response. That's been primarily done in terms of the surface oil. And so you see all of the vessels running around, the booming, the skimming operations. And the second phase, which is just getting underway, is called a hindcast. And what we're attempting to do is take the observations of the system and then predict what has happened in the past using information that we have to try to understand the transport, fate, and impact of the oil that's been released. So the summary is forecasting has been done, and the hindcasting is just getting underway in earnest. Next. So here's an example of the oil spill forecast that NOAA was running. So NOAA is the scientific support for the Coast Guard, and they essentially do this on a routine basis. They take estimates of the surface oil, input on the currents and winds, and then distribution of where the oil was, and then predict where it's going to be. So there's a typical composite map that was provided to the spill response community, and that was when they started, it was every day, and when the event got going in earnest, it was 3 or 4 times a day. Next. If you'd like to see a macro summary, this is the template of all of those pictures done on a daily basis from April 20th to July 15th. So April 20th, let us remind ourselves that that's the date the spill started, and July 15th is the date they essentially capped it. It wasn't until September 19th that the well was officially declared dead, but the release stopped on the 15th. And you can see this is essentially the southeast Gulf of southeast Louisiana coastal area, and you can see the size and the distribution of the oil, the surface oil. This is not the subsurface oil, just the oil at the surface. Next. So here's the government's current best estimate about the oil distribution, where it was in the environment. And so what they've suggested is that it turns out they used 640 miles of boom and 40,000 people and recovered 3% of the oil with booming operations. So a really tough road to hoe. Burning, they did some test burns early in the spill, so they've estimated 5%. And then they've naturally dispersed. This is due to breaking waves, 15, 16. And then a quarter of it evaporated, so went into the atmosphere as evaporative products. And then the rest either dispersed or residual in the water column. This picture, this diagram has drawn lots of controversy in the community. There's lots of discussion over the underlying support of this diagram, and NOAA is due to give a summary report that backs up this diagram in either, I would guess, late October or early November would be the summary. But this issue will be a bone of contention among the various players involved because it's so important to understand where the oil is and how it got distributed. Next. Here. I went on more than a few television programs and radio interviews, and I forcefully said that there was no chance of the oil from the Gulf of Mexico spill getting to the East Coast and particularly to Rhode Island coastal waters. And I had been quoted fairly widely as saying that, and somebody passed this to me and asked me what I thought. And I said, so if you were to note the scale on this, they released what they thought was oil, and then they followed it over 130 days, and they showed a contour of the concentrations. So the concentrations are given from 0 to 0.2, right? So we'll forget about the units, whatever they are. Anyway, the trouble is that if something dilutes a factor of 1,000 or 1,000,000 or 10 million, it's yellow. So if you started off with the oil at a part per million, or 2 parts per million, or 10 parts per million in the Gulf, and then diluted it another 10 million parts, I think it would be impossible to find it. Okay, next. This was the vehicle by which it was supposed to happen, which is this feature is called the loop current. Comes in through the Yucatan Straits, out through the Florida Straits. Supposed to go far enough north to pick up that spill site, carry the oil on the eastern side of the loop current, take it out through the Florida Straits up to the Gulf Stream. So I went on record in saying the loop current never goes that far north, and is not going to this time. So next. This shows a picture of the location of the loop current, May 1, May 15th, June 1, June 15th. Good so far, right? Not there so far. Next. And here it is all the way through the mid-August. So the loop current, turns out, did what it normally does, which is penetrated north when it was at a far north and extended, pinched off. There was a loop or an eddy generated that went to the west, and the loop current short-circuited and is quite complicated. So we never ended up with the oil being entrained in the loop current, and the loop current never ended getting far enough north. Next. So this is my last slide. Here's where we are. The modeling framework to do the transport and fate of the oil for both surface and subsurface oil, and to also do the impact assessment in terms of the impact on the environment, including fish and birds and marine mammals. That's all in place, all well developed, all extensively tested, and all widely used. So we have all of the tools that are necessary to do that. The significant challenges in this case and they are not inconsequential, which is the oil release rate. We've essentially been given a quote of 62,000 barrels a day. But you and I would know that it's probably some uncertainty in that. And what we don't know is what that uncertainty is. The mapping of the subsurface oil concentrations, we got very excited about this, but late in the spill. So there's an enormous amount of effort going in the mapping. The problem is that much of the oil is widely dispersed. So the time when you would be able to most readily measure it was when the spill was ongoing, and yet our mapping effort got delayed till now. So it will be very difficult to come up with a map that represents what happened in evolution in time. The oil droplet size distribution sounds like it's incredibly boring. It is, but it makes a really big difference. A big drop of oil goes to the sea surface in a day. A little drop of oil goes to the sea surface in a year, right? And the median size probably goes up in tens or hundreds of days. So what we really got to worry about is those little droplets of oil. The biodegradation rates of the oil, we have a lot of experience with biodegradation at the surface, not much at depth, and we don't have much experience on what those rates would be in those kinds of environments. The oil mass balance, I already told you, there's a lot of uncertainty. The other problem with oil spills normally is what we would really like to know is a characterization of the environment pre the event and then post the event. So we're characterizing the environment post the event, and pre the event is a real problem. So with that, I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. And Bob, now your technical challenge of the evening, bringing us live, Admiral Mary Landry. Admiral Landry, we really appreciate you being here tonight. We recognize the fact that you are obviously involved in a case that's still going on, and we're looking forward to what you can tell us about what it was like as the person in charge when you learned about this spill on April the 20th.
Good evening, Dennis. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, Mary.
Good evening, Dennis. Can you hear me? Good evening, Dennis. Can you hear me? I'm going to go ahead and proceed and assume you can hear me. I'm getting some feedback from my own computer, so hopefully you can hear me. It's great to be with all of you. Thank you. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I want to thank all the members of the panel who obviously contributed to this extraordinary effort, the Deepwater Horizon, and certainly shout out to all the Coast Guard members in the room there. If you weren't in school, you would have been probably pulled down here for a detail. So enjoy your time at URI. I certainly enjoyed mine, and I carried with me many, many lessons from Dennis and the team up there that were most helpful in responding to this crisis, this particular challenge. Could I have the next slide, please? You heard from the previous two people who were very involved in this response, and if you could just understand, the 8th District Commander, I've been down here a year. I was, pretty much ready for hurricane season, and I also had flown off to and visited the rigs offshore with Thunder Horse, Independence. They're some of the largest rigs in the world. We did a national level security exercise in the offshore environment when I first got here to look at what if there were a threat against the LOOP, the Louisiana Offshore Oil Platform, or against refineries in the region. And I agree with Dennis, when you look at the great work that's been done, the body of work that's been done nationwide since the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, I would have looked at this prior to this incident as an area of low risk. So certainly this kind of caught us all off guard. And but I can tell you the extraordinary efforts put forth by everyone in this, whether it was federal agencies, state agencies, local communities, the private sector, the volunteers. It was what I call a national good. And as hard as this was and as difficult as this was, I was always buoyed in my confidence that we could get through this based on the knowledge that we had such extraordinary capacity in this country to respond to a crisis like this. When this event occurred, April 20th, as the district commander, you get briefed right away. I have 7 sectors that divide up this district, 4 of which are the coastal sectors. All 4 coastal sectors were on alert. Sector out of New Orleans was running point, if you will, on the actual offshore incident, the explosion, the fire, and the search and rescue case was being coordinated right out of here, out of the command center just up the hall from where I am right now. The important things to know, 2 things that are really important to understand. You look at that fire and you look at what's going on out there, and that's in daylight the second day. The night of this event, when the explosion first occurred, we had offshore supply vessel, the Damon B. Bankston, and we also had Coast Guard helicopters that rescued 115 people in a very, very treacherous environment in rescuing folks while this thing was on fire. And it's very sad that we lost 11 people, but 115 were rescued. And if anybody is really curious, if you go back to a 1988 incident in the North Sea, the Piper Alpha, and you research that, 167 people lost their lives. So this was an extraordinary search and rescue case, and a very much a success in being able to rescue 115 people. The other thing that's important, we're doing the firefighting, and we're also doing the response to the potential pollution, but we also were very attentive to the marine casualty investigation. And I'm an inspector by trade and a marine casualty investigator, spent my career in this field, and it was very important to get out to those survivors as soon as possible and question them and make an inquiry. And we do this, we have a memorandum of understanding with the former MMS, now BOEMRE, and basically we had our investigators fly out to a rig, land, and the Damon Bankston, the OSV that was bringing the survivors in, picked up our investigators from both Coast Guard and MMS to be able to get the first impressions from these 115 survivors. And I do believe those investigations and the dialogue we had with those survivors very much informed the work that's going on in the Marine Board. So before we even get into the actual case, I'm in the same building with the U.S. Attorney here, Jim Letton, who's the lead for the federal government on the investigation on the criminal side, but the Coast Guard has a responsibility for a civil administrative proceeding and investigation, and I think there's a great body of work that was done initially there. So search and rescue case, obviously potential pollution case, and then also the marine casualty case were very important and paramount in making sure we got it done. Next slide, please. Now, this is a very busy slide, and I humbly apologize for it, but if you can understand, before I came here, I had done some work in pandemic preparedness, H5N1 preparedness, if you will. And if you look at the work we've done in this country since 9/11 and since Katrina, and even the basis by which we wrote the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 and for the last 20 years responded to oil spills, it all falls under the same incident command system, if you will, that the federal agencies and the state agencies and the locals are very familiar with, as is the private sector. Well, when you look at a scale and a scope of the potential of this incident, I was having discussions that very morning, Wednesday morning, with the Commandant of the Coast Guard and with Admiral Papp, who was then the area commander, about the fact that this had a potential to be the worst case scenario, and we had it in the logs right away that when they filed the permit with MMS for this response, that it could be upwards of 110 to 162,000 barrels per day could be lost from this well. So that was kind of your worst case scenario. And the document from the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 requires that the Coast Guard lean forward and prepare for a worst case scenario. So from day one, we were looking at this to have scale and scope that was quite extraordinary. And at that point, we were still not sure if the well was shut in or not. They weren't sure if the BOP had activated. They had other mechanisms that, fail-safe devices, if you will, that could close and shut in this well. So we weren't sure if we were dealing with a fire that was developed from residual. There were 700,000 gallons of diesel on board. We weren't sure if this well was shut in or not, but we knew that we had to deal with a potential worst case scenario. And that org chart you're looking at shows how we have evolved our national response framework, if you will. The Department of Homeland Security stood up after 9/11. The National Response Plan was written. It was informed and updated after Katrina and rewritten to the National Response Framework based on lessons learned. So here we sat with this National Response Framework and an understanding that we have a concept called the National Incident Commander, who in a spill of this level could stand up and take the lead and represent our Secretary Napolitano and the President and all the cabinet level secretaries and being the point person. So this org chart actually was announced on the 29th of April. That first week that we were responding to this and working this, we were building up to this, and Admiral Allen and I were having discussions, and I know he was in DC saying, you know, we're probably going to need a National Incident Commander for this. But if you look down the next level, the Federal On-Scene Coordinator, that is the title I held until the 1st of June when I had to come back for hurricane duties. As the Federal On-Scene Coordinator, that's a title that's under the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. And this is where you take the responsible party, the state agencies that could be affected, and you work with everyone to bring a whole of government and private sector response in play. Basically what we formed. I last used this probably the most in a serious spill in Buzzards Bay, the Buzzards Bay oil spill that took place there in Rhode Island and threatened Rhode Island and southeastern Mass. That was the last time we used this, and that was a much smaller scale, but the concepts are the same, very much the same. The interesting thing, though, for everyone, why I call it a national good for what we've all worked on, is this is the first time we've ever used the National Incident Command and operationalized it. I think as much as you have challenges in a response of this scale and scope, I think it was a proven concept, and we were very fortunate to have this concept take place. Next slide, please. I'm going to move through these quickly because I think the most important part of this night might be the ability to get into dialogue and questions and answers. You're just looking at kind of the multidimensional. We had an offshore event taking place, 5,000 feet below the surface of the water, and that was a command post called Source Control, if you will, run out of BP headquarters in Houston, but they were monitoring all the OSVs that were working below the surface. And then we mentioned the coastal states that were in the offshore zone, the nearshore zone, and you see the coast of Louisiana, Texas, which was mildly affected, and then Mississippi, Alabama, and the panhandle of Florida. So you had this offshore, this nearshore, and this inshore work, and then we had the well site itself. Next slide. We talked and you heard a little bit about skimming, in situ burning, dispersants, both surface and subsurface. What was a challenge here is we've done skimming, we've done in situ burning, we've done dispersant application. We had pre-authorization for the Gulf Coast, for the Gulf of Mexico. We had never envisioned subsurface when that pre-approval was given. So the crossing the threshold to inject subsea dispersants at 5,000 feet below the surface was something that was a threshold we hadn't crossed, and took a lot of courage on the part of the agencies, but also a lot of science and testing. We did 3 different tests before we actually authorized that pre-approval for subsea dispersant. And it was only with an understanding that we would follow strict protocols for monitoring and measuring the impact this was going to have in the response. And if you could also understand the challenge, and the Coast Guard members involved in response in the room can talk to you more about it, you have tools in a toolkit. Your goal is, our number 1 goal was securing the source. Our number 2 goal was to fight this as far offshore as possible. Our number 3 goal was, if it hit the shore, to minimize the environmental impact and the economic impact to these communities. And then certainly, as you look at those goals, you're sitting there and certainly making sure everybody stayed safe and nobody was hurt in the process. But when you're looking at those goals and you have these tools in the toolkit, some of them are very weather dependent. Skimming is very weather dependent. In situ burning is very weather dependent. Surface dispersant application is very weather dependent. So the ability to inject subsea had a promise and a potential to be a tool that we could use when the weather was inclement, and it was very important. Next slide, we'll just quickly give you a little bit of a, I talk about the body of work we've done in the last 20 years, and anybody who's done pollution response in the last 20 years can tell you we've come a long way in some things, but I can also tell you that we were using systems that hadn't really been, the R&D and the investments had not been made in the last few years for some of these, some of the equipment, so it required a lot of improvisation. And this vessel of opportunity concept was one where you took, we had the Oil Spill Response Organization skimmers, which those are the folks that by the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 are required to be in place. We also had Navy skimmers, we had foreign skimmers, and then we took fishing vessels and we modified them to be able to participate in spill response. And when you take that many entities and try to get them to orchestrate and work together, it could be a real challenge. But I think that's one of the best practices that has come from this response. Next slide, please. Two things I want to mention with this that are important is we had Katrina and we had Gustav and Ike, and we actually had a response in Haiti. We had a system that we learned in Katrina and Rita called the Maritime Transportation System Recovery Unit to make sure we could get energy back online, to make sure we could keep ports open and running in the wake of a natural disaster. The Maritime Transportation System Recovery Unit was stood up, and the slide you're looking at there shows how we were tracking cleaning stations so that we could keep the maritime traffic going into the ports of New Orleans, going into Houston, Galveston, going into the Loop, the Louisiana offshore oil platform, you know, tankers that come from around the world to supply our nation's energy. How can we do this in the midst of the spill? And we had learned a tremendous amount from Katrina, Rita, and then obviously informed and used it in Haiti to assist another country. And that was one of those national goods that we take and export to aid other countries. And Haiti, they stood it up to get the ports open. The other thing was Tyndall Air Force Base doing what we call airspace deconfliction. They had worked in Haiti, and the example there was 40 planes a day for supplies, and they got it up to 140 planes a day because they can take the airspace and manage it. And we had to do that for as many aviation assets as were flying in this region during the response. So those are two best practices, if you will, that we used in the arsenal. Next slide quickly, and I'm watching my time here and I don't want to go over because I want to leave enough. You mentioned how many people were involved. At the height, it was 46,000 people. We had over almost 700 skimmers. Now, if you would have asked me, would I ever envision a response of this magnitude, I would have said no. And it's phenomenal when you think of what we brought together to this fight, to this challenge. It was extraordinary. National Geospatial Agency, coastal research centers, folks that are on this panel, everybody came together to contribute to this national crisis. And I just think it's a great thing that we have the capacity we have, and we had things come from other countries as well. So to pull this all together was very extraordinary. It went beyond the scale and scope of anything I think that was envisioned in OPA 90, but the body of work and the work we've done under that piece of legislation, I think did form the basis and the foundation from which we responded to this wildlife rehabilitation. That was an extraordinary effort to stand that up across the Gulf Coast and rescue and save many of the wildlife that were impacted. Critical resources, as I mentioned, next slide. That just gives you some of the numbers. The fate of the oil. I think go to the next slide, please. I want to try to wrap this up quickly. The fate of the oil, you're going to hear from some great experts who participated in this, but they called it the flow rate technical group. And I was in testifying before the commission in DC on Monday, and then I stuck around and listened to the folks who were brought together. And this is another best practice. This is the first time we've ever used this and done this, but you pull scientists from around the country along with NOAA and Department of Energy folks, and you research institutions, and you bring these great minds together, and you try to work on what is going on 5,000 feet below the surface. How do we know how much oil is being emitted, and how do we How do we track the impact this oil is going to have on the overall environment? And this group recommended, as they spoke before the commission the other day, that we have a standing body ready to go. And believe me, I'm in favor. As a person who struggled with working with MMS and BP to try to figure out what we were up against, I'm absolutely in favor of a group like that being a best practice going forward, because they did extraordinary work. Next slide. Sheer scope and complexity, as I mentioned before. I kept using a signal to people as they come into the command post. We're bringing people from strike teams around the country and everything, and I would go like this, and what I meant by that was anything you think or that this is, you need to readjust your reality. This is a whole new reality. This goes well beyond the scale and scope of anything you envision. So the response in that way was quite extraordinary and quite challenging, but I really think we did a great job. This upper right-hand picture is a common operating picture. Picture sitting in a command post with 10 different GIS systems. BP's got one. You know, we have the Homeland Security Information Network that is run by DHS. We have NOAA's IRMA COP, and we are trying to be transparent. We're trying to track everything that's going on, and we're also trying to distribute information to everybody to integrate not only the response, but to share with the general public what's going on. This was a work in itself, and that IRMA COP that you see up there became a body of integration input from many agencies, not just one, integrating the information from a COP, a common operating picture, in many different GIS databases. Moving forward, next slide. I think I'll end there. You know, pretty much, you know, we're still in the response phase here. We're absolutely still have a command post. Admiral Paul Zacump is in the process of relieving Admiral Allen of the National Incident Commander duties, but he's also got the FOSC duties down here, and they will stay and manage this until we feel like we've got enough in place that we can probably pass the baton back to D8, to the standing units that are, but we're in hurricane season. We've got to respond to other things going on, but there's a great body of work that's going to be done here, and certainly, as you know, the National Resource Damage Assessment process, the coastal restoration process. I didn't mention early on, but I should tell you, even before Admiral Allen was brought in as the National Incident Commander, I had several cabinet level secretaries and the President himself commit all the resources we needed for this response. So you had that sense of confidence that you were going to get everything you needed to do this response. And I'll stop there, and then we'll be able to answer questions if you have any later.
Mary, thank you so much. That was a fabulous presentation, and we will be getting back to you later. Mary will receive next month one of URI's Distinguished Alumni Achievement Awards for her work on this spill. Our next presenter is Professor Peter Cornellin. You heard Mary just mention this issue of flow rate analysis. Peter normally does satellite oceanography, but was called in to work on this particular issue. Peter, tell us how it went.
Thanks, Dennis. Okay, I'm going to try to tell you, give you a timeline for the spill flow rate estimates and why there was so much confusion. And I have two objectives in the talk, in the presentation. One is to explain how flow rate estimates were made and what made them hard. And the second is to try to describe some of the behind-the-scenes goings-on, which I made myself a little bit unpopular, I guess. So why is Peter Cornellin so unpopular? At least with some people in Washington. I'll do this in the context of, we got to turn this on, in the context of a flow rate timeline up here. So this will appear in most of my slides as sort of the thread that's going to link the pieces of the story together. So let's start in the beginning. Deepwater Horizon exploded and sank April 20th, and there's a little star there that you can see, which is where we start. One of the things that's interesting is I believe they were pumping 8,000 barrels a day out of that well prior to the explosion. I'm not positive about that, but I believe that's the case. So I drew a line across here that's 8,000 barrels a day. And this is time in days. Well, I'm sorry, this is the date. This is April 20th, May 1st, June 1st, July 1st, and August 1st. So on the 23rd of April, there were first indications. There were at first indications that there was no oil leaking from the well. On the 24th, I believe there were video cameras on the seafloor that saw that there was oil leaking, and so there was an estimate made of 1,000 barrels a day. I've got little circles here which will indicate the how many barrels a day and what day it was on. It'll be orange if that was the estimate of the volume. It'll be green if it was a lower bound, and red if it was an upper bound in the estimate. And you'll see that the bound stuff becomes part of the story in a bit. On the 28th of April, estimates of the flow rate were increased to 5,000 barrels a day based on aircraft and satellite data. This is just a satellite image from the 29th showing the spill here. Then on the 13th of May, there's what I'd call the NPR bombshell. That's where NPR went out, and I don't know if they solicited the input or what exactly happened, but they got a hold of Steve Worley at Purdue University, and he used PIV technology, and I'll tell you a bit about that in a second. Unfortunately, we can't dim the lights down because there's got to be, oh yes we can, there, look at that. So what you're seeing there is this is the flow out of the well. This is the sort of data that he was dealing with, and he used what's called PIV to make an estimate. And his estimate was 70,000 barrels a day. So there was a pretty big difference. How does PIV work, or particle image velocimetry? Well, the idea is to use the displacement of things in the fluid to estimate the velocity. So if you look at this figure, and then I go to the next one, you can see a little bit of movement. I'm going back and forth now. First one, second one is 0.07 seconds later, and you can see there's a little blob there that moves, and you can actually see the fluid is moving all around. Well, the idea is you use a computer to track all those little parts that are moving around, and you end up with a picture that looks like this. This is the end of the pipe, and it comes up with velocity velocity measures all along here. And to get the flow rate, you have to multiply the average velocity by some area. And so what he assumed was that it was a cylinder, and this was the diameter of the cylinder, and he comes up with his estimate, and that's where he got the 70,000 barrels a day. That, I think, gave rise to the idea of a flow rate task group. The NIC Interagency Solutions Group formed. One of the reporters who called me up said he always referred to this as the fart G. But it's actually the flow rate technical group, and it was chaired by Marcia McNutt. And there were a number of people on it, and I was on it for some period of time. They were mainly people from universities, although there were some feds on it as well. The flow rate technical group was broken up into 4 teams. A plume modeling team that was to use the videos at the seafloor to make the estimates, and those were thought to be the most accurate because they were seeing the oil that was really coming out. A mass balance team that was used that would do something like what Malcolm showed, where you look at what's on the surface, what's evaporated, and sum all those up. And then there were two teams that worked together, the nodal analysis team and the reservoir modeling team, that used the characteristics of the pressure in the pipe and the physics associated with flow in the pipe to make estimates as well. But most of the results came out of the plume modeling team, and that's actually the one I was affiliated with, even though my expertise now is remote sensing. I was not once asked to make any comments about anything to do with remote sensing while I was on this group. So. A day later, actually, BP had a tube that they had stuck up inside this big tube that was gushing oil, and they were siphoning off 5,000 barrels a day. They called it a straw, and you could see that there was a lot more coming off. So I put that on as a low estimate, a lower bound, because clearly there was more coming off than that, and that lower bound was at the same level as the estimate of what was flowing at that time. My role in the FRTG was to validate the estimates, primarily the PIV numbers. The 5,000 barrels a day number that came from NOAA is based on 2 estimates from what I could see. One was sort of a PIV-like approach where they looked at sequences of images. That's the one I had access to, and I took their numbers and ran them through, multiplied them together, and I got 10,000 barrels a day instead of 5,000. So I brought that up with the people in charge of the flow rate technical group. And the estimate wasn't revised, but that's because our group was to come out with another estimate a few days later, and they thought it would be confusing to change it at that point. There are difficulties in making the estimates from the plume data. So I'm going to go through some of these difficulties to give you a sense of what's involved, how do you make the estimate, and what are the roadblocks. So the first thing was determining number and location of leaks. Everybody sort of envisions this thing where there's a leak. Well, it didn't quite work that way. This is a map of the seafloor here. This is that long pipe that Malcolm showed you a schematic of, and it actually ends up here. It's that mile of pipe that fell from the rig and landed all over the seafloor. These other parts of the debris mapped out in the debris field. The scale here is 400 feet. It was determined, it was thought at least at the time, that there were two leaks. The major leak at the end of the riser, this long thing that went up, which was here, that's this guy here, and a smaller leak right where the pipe bent over, that's this one here. And can you stop this, Bob, or are you gone? Oh, he's gone. He's the wrong side of the room. It's too late. Don't worry about it. It's too late. This is the flow. Don't worry about it. This is the flow that's coming out of the major part of the pipe. And one of the things that you could see in there is that part of the flow was white and part of the flow was black initially, and that changed over the course of this 10 seconds. The part that was white was the gas hydrides that Malcolm mentioned. The part that's black is the oil, and over the course of this 10 seconds, the ratio of that changed. You could also see that it looks like the oil might have wrapped around in front of the white to some extent, the gas hydrides, and so that it was masking it. So some of the problems that you have are that there's part of the flow you're not interested in. The gas hydrides go and dissolve in the water column and aren't the problem. It's the oil that we're primarily interested in. The oil is opaque, so it masks what's going on inside, and it's very turbulent, as you can see there. This is the top of the blowout preventer, right where the blowout preventer is down here, where the pipe bends over, and this is the oil gushing out here, and estimates were made here. But we didn't know if these were the only two places that there was a leak, and so there was consternation early on in our discussions about that. And this is just a schematic that shows you the same thing repeated, so I'll skip over that. So that was the first problem. The second problem was just plain getting the videos, and I could go into long detail on that, but I won't. Third problem was video quality. Here's one of the videos that we were given. There's the pipe. This is the oil coming out, and there's the oil coming around. And right now, it becomes more than difficult to make an estimate of what the flow rate would be. So there was a lot of there was a lot of complaining about the quality of the videos. As I mentioned, we had the separation of the gas hydrides from the oil was important, variability in the flow, the opacity of the oil, and the turbulent nature of the flow. All of those things make it difficult to come up with an estimate of what the flow rate is, even though it seems like it should be pretty straightforward. So back to the flow rate technical group. Early on in our discussions, I suggested that we should have an estimate of the upper bound and the spill as well as the lower bound. There was a focus on making a lower bound estimate. One of my colleagues countered that because of the problems that I just listed, an upper bound would be, and these are quotes here from him, irresponsible and scientifically unjustifiable. The concern was that the press would seize on the upper bound, and that's a really important point that I want to get back to at the end of my presentation. So I volunteered to collect information from other members on the group where they would send it to me and I wouldn't reveal who sent it in. And I did. I received 3 estimates. One upper bound was 55,000 barrels a day, second was 70,000, and the third one was 83,000 barrels a day. These were the upper bounds that this fellow here said were irresponsible and scientifically unjustifiable, and the press would have focused on. I want to argue that had we had those, life would have been a lot easier for a lot of people later on. The FRTG, a few days later, issued 2 estimates for the range of the lower bound. So they're in green here. One based on PIV was 12 to 25,000 barrels a day. There was a second one that they released, which included some remote sensing information from what I understood later, which was 12,000 to 19,000 barrels a day. This second one was never discussed in any of the group's meetings, but it was released as part of the group's report. I don't know where it came from. Prior to the release of those data, we had a telecon in which we talked about these things, and I raised two concerns. One was I thought that a range in the lower bound would be misinterpreted as an upper and lower bound, as the entire range. And the second was I was concerned that I hadn't seen the numbers going into the estimate that we discussed, the 12 to 25,000. And so I had both of those concerns. I suggested text that we could modify, text to modify the report, and I was told that we didn't need to make those modifications. So I asked that my name be removed from the report. But I volunteered to continue working with the group. And my name remained on the Part G, but was removed from the report, as I had asked. However, I think it was also removed from their email list, because that's basically the last I ever heard from them. So all the inside information about how the measurements were made, this is where it sort of ends. But I will go on with the story. I want to say I owe a big thanks to Thad Allen, who did his best to support my contention that a range on the lower bound would have been too complicated, because he continually repeated for at least 10 days in his daily briefings, almost every day he came out with these numbers, 12 to 19,000 and 12 to 25,000 barrels a day as the range of the whole spill. And I don't think he really knew that these were arranged in a lower bound. I don't think there was anything malicious here. I think it was just plain too confusing. And the press did much the same thing. Okay, so now we move to the 3rd of June. BP prepares to connect the cap to the riser. And what they do is they cut the riser off. So if you remember, the well comes out of the ground and then it had fallen over. So they cut the part that had fallen over off. This is what it looked like after they cut it. It was a little ragged, but it still cut it off. And the oil was gushing straight up now. There was there was an argument that the flow rate would increase by about 20%. It didn't have to go through the long pipe, but nobody really knew for sure. But it also made the calculations, the PIV estimates, a lot easier to do, among other things. On 6th of June, the well is partially capped, and BP started pumping 10,000 barrels a day from the cap. There was still more escaping, so the 10,000, that moves the sort of lower limit up to 10,000 a day. You know it's got to be more than that. The FRTG estimate comes up with an estimate, a range now that I was no longer involved, 20,000 to 40,000 barrels a day on 10th of June. On the 18th of June, they upped that to 35 to 60,000 barrels a day. These ranges came from not only the PIV information, but what was coming out of the cap. And on the 5th of August, that was the first mention that I actually found of the 53,000 barrels a day, plus or minus 5,000 barrels a day, which I believe is the range that they're looking at now, but I don't know for sure. Just want to remind you that the 3 upper bound estimates that I received on the 23rd of May were 55,000, 70, and 83,000 barrels a day. Not outrageous in terms of upper bound estimates. So how much is 50,000 barrels a day? Well, it's 2 million gallons a day, 100,000 per miles a day. It's 24 gallons a second. Dennis and I tried to work that out. We spent about a half an hour on it, finally gave up. So I went back and did it with the calculator. 50,000 barrels a day for about 90 days. This 20 April to 15 June is about 5 million barrels. 53,000 barrels a day is the rate after the riser was cut. Remember that it was argued that when the riser was cut, that rate would have gone up. So it could be as much as 20% higher. And the rate may have changed due to natural processes as well. There have been arguments that the reservoir was becoming somewhat depleted, so the pressure was going down and other things like that. The bottom line is that how much really was spilled is still, I think, a large unknown, and will be unknown for a while to come. So I have a few concluding remarks. The first one is that experts can have trouble stepping back to see the big picture. What I found really interesting was that the people who made the most reasonable, or were even willing to come up with an upper bound on the amount being spilled, were not oil spill experts. They were fluid anemicists who looked at it and said, well, you know, I don't have to worry about the 3% changes. I'm going to step back and get a picture. The other guys were just totally hobbled by all the little details they could think about. The second is that the press can really have a chilling effect on obtaining important information in a politically charged environment. There's no doubt that there was concern within the group about what would be done if we came out with a big number, that people would seize the upper end of that big number, and that would become the estimate. And so they didn't come up with an estimate. And I think that that actually hurt some of the operations later on, where you found that they didn't have enough surface ships for the oil coming up. Those with little to lose can be the most objective and the freest to say what they think. That's sort of obvious, but there weren't too many people with little to lose on that group. And so that was another interesting thing. And I don't know if I'm allowed to say things like this, but since I'm up here, I'm going to anyway.
You can say anything.
I don't think the person in charge should have been a Fed. I think it should be somebody from the outside, and I also think it should be somebody from the outside who is not somebody who has a lot of funding in oil spill analysis now, but somebody who has enough common sense to be able to sort through the other stuff and not have all these other ties. I think that was a real problem. And finally, the flow rate in a blowout is really hard to determine with accuracy. That's it.
Well, thank you, Peter. You might not be popular with the FART G, but you're still a very popular professor here at GSL. With that, I'd like to declare it's break time, and let's take about a 10-minute break. The refreshments in the lobby will start again in 10 minutes. Thank you very much.